She was 8 months pregnant, alone on an empty Wyoming road, with a locked box that could get her killed and a gun she was not afraid to use. When the wheel broke and the storm hit and the contractions started all at once, all on the same God-forsaken stretch of nowhere, she pointed that gun at the only person who stopped to help her. He had no weapon. He had never told her that. What happened in the next 12 hours would change both of their lives forever. But what happened in the next 12 months that would change everything she had ever believed about trust, about family, and about what it means to finally stop running. This is a story about a woman who thought she was escaping her past. She was actually riding straight toward her future. Stay with us. You will not want to miss a single mile of this one. Here on this channel, we tell the stories of the American West where love was hard-earned, loyalty was everything, and ordinary people found extraordinary courage in the most unforgiving land on earth. Stories of cowboys and widows, of mothers who fought for their children, of strangers who became family, and of hearts that refused to give up even when the odds said otherwise. If that is the kind of story that speaks to you, you are exactly where you belong. What this story teaches us: the people who save us are rarely the ones we expected. Sometimes the greatest gift is a stranger who stops when everyone else would have ridden past. If this story moved you, leave a comment below and tell us what moment stayed with you. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe so you never miss another story from the heart of the West. And if you believe stories like this one matter, hit that like button and help us keep telling them.
They say Wyoming can kill a person 3 ways: the cold, the loneliness, or the secrets the land buries for you. The morning I met Colt McKenzie, I was staring down all 3. My name is Eleanor Callahan. Most people call me Ellie. I am 24 years old, Irish-American by blood, widow by circumstance, and 8 months pregnant with twins by the grace of God and the cruelty of timing. I had been driving a wagon alone across the Wyoming grasslands for 3 days, and I had approximately 40 miles left between me and my sister Vera's boarding house in Harlow Creek, when the sky decided it had been patient long enough. I noticed the clouds first, the way they piled up from the northwest like a dark wall being pushed by something enormous and angry. In Ireland, where my father was born, they say a sky that color means God is making a decision. In Wyoming, that sky means you have about 20 minutes before the decision is made for you. I snapped the reins and urged the horses faster. Beneath the wagon seat, wrapped in an old flour sack and wedged against the footboard, a locked wooden box shifted with every rut in the road. My hand moved to steady it before I steadied myself. I had been doing that for 3 days without noticing. The box mattered more than I wanted to admit. I was not simply going to visit my sister. I want to be honest about that from the beginning, because the rest of this story will not make sense if you think I was an ordinary woman on an ordinary journey. I was running. I had been running since the night Thomas Callahan died 6 weeks ago, and I had not stopped long enough to ask myself what I was running toward until the wheel of my wagon dropped into a washout hidden by tall grass, and the whole right side of the rig lurched down into the mud with a sound like a breaking bone. The horses stopped. The box shifted hard against my leg. And then the first contraction hit. Not the uncomfortable pressure I had been managing for 2 days. Something different, lower, real. The kind of pain that does not ask permission and does not accept negotiation. I climbed down from the wagon and stood in the grass with my hands pressed against my sides and looked at the wheel buried to the axle in soft mud, and I said, out loud, to no one, to the 2 lives growing inside me, not yet. We are not doing this yet. The sky did not care about my opinion. I was trying to figure out how to free the wheel when I heard hoofbeats coming from the north. A single rider moving at a controlled pace along a ridgeline above me. He saw me at the same moment I saw him. I could tell by the way he pulled up and went still, assessing. For a moment, he did not move. Then he came down. He rode at a measured pace, not rushing, not cautious, just deliberate. The gait of a man who had made a decision and was executing it without drama. He was tall in the saddle, black-haired, wearing a canvas duster that the wind was trying to take from him. His hat was pulled low against the first drops of rain. I had the pistol out of my bag before he reached the bottom of the ridge. He pulled up 10 yards away and looked at the gun without changing expression. Ellie said, "Stop right there." He stopped. His hands opened and stayed visible. Colt said, "I'm not armed, and if you don't lower that, the storm is going to make this decision for both of us." I looked at his eyes. I have spent years learning to read men's eyes, specifically looking for what lives behind them when they think no one is watching. Cruelty, calculation, the particular kind of contempt that some men carry toward women alone. I did not find any of those things in his eyes. What I found was something quieter and harder to name. Something that looked like a man who had stopped expecting anything good from the world and was therefore very calm about whatever came next. I lowered the gun. I did not put it away. Ellie said, "Who are you?" Colt said, "Colt Mackenzie. I work the territory between here and Harlow Creek. You need help with that wheel or not?" Ellie said, "The wheel is the least of my problems right now." He looked at me then. Really looked. The way a person does when they are calculating a situation, rather than just observing it. His eyes moved from my face to my midsection and back up, and something shifted in his expression. Not pity. Something more serious than pity. Colt said, "How far along?" Ellie said, 8 months. Twins." Colt said, "And the pain started when?" Ellie said, "About 5 minutes ago." He was off his horse before I finished the sentence. He moved to the horses first, talking to them quietly, calming them. Then to the wagon. Then to me. Colt said, "There's a trapper's cabin 1/2 a mile west, still standing. It'll have a stove." Ellie said, "I don't know you." Colt said, "No, but you don't have a better option, and we both know it." He was right. I hated that he was right. But I have spent enough time in the territory to know when the land has made a choice on your behalf. Another contraction took my breath away completely. When it passed, I looked at him and said, "Who are you running from?" Colt said, "Nobody." Ellie said, "Then why are you out here alone?" A pause. Brief. He got the horses moving before he answered. Colt said, "Because I prefer it." We reached the cabin as the storm broke fully overhead. Rain on the roof like 1,000 fists. I looked at the small, dark interior. A rope bunk, a table, a cold stove, one grimy window, and understood that this was where my carefully planned journey was going to end, and something entirely unplanned was going to begin. I looked at Colt Mackenzie standing in the doorway with rain dripping from his hat brim, and I said the words that I had not said to another living person in longer than I could remember. Ellie said, "I need help." Colt said, "I know. Come inside." The cabin smelled of old wood smoke and pine resin, and the particular cold that gathers in places where no one has made a fire for several months. Colt had one going in the stove within 5 minutes. I was on the rope bunk by then, working through the contractions with the focused determination of a woman who has decided that fear is a luxury she cannot afford right now. Colt worked efficiently and without panic, which was the most reassuring thing about him. He did not tell me everything was going to be fine. He did not make promises he could not keep. He simply moved, heating water, pulling blankets from my bag, assessing the situation with the calm eyes of someone who has had to make fast decisions in difficult conditions before. He told me later that his hands were not shaking. I believed him about his hands. I could not see his jaw. Ellie said, "You've done this before." Colt said, "Not with people." Ellie said, "That is not as reassuring as you seem to think it is." Colt said, "It's more reassuring than the alternative, which is someone who's never done it at all." He was right again. I was developing a grudging respect for how often he was right. The labor came fast and hard, the way early labors sometimes do, as though the babies had been waiting for the moment I finally stopped moving and decided this was their opportunity. I focused on breathing, on the rhythm Colt established with his voice, low, steady, counting. On anything except the fear that they were coming 6 weeks too early, and I did not know what that meant. The first baby came just as the storm reached its full fury overhead. Rain hammering the roof, wind finding every gap in the old log walls. And in the middle of all that noise, a new person arrived in the world, small and slippery and furious at the cold, and then went silent. The silence lasted 8 seconds. I know it was 8 seconds because I counted every one of them. I counted them the way you count when you are on the edge of something terrible, and the counting is the only thing keeping you from going over. Colt moved quickly. He did something I could not see clearly from where I lay. A motion, repeated. A breath, applied carefully. A whispered word that I could not catch over the sound of the storm. And then, thin, wavering. The smallest sound I had ever heard in my life. The most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my life. I cried. I am not a person who cries easily or often, and I cried like I had been holding it in for 6 months, which I had been. Colt said, "You have a son." His voice was rough at the edges. I noted that. I noted it carefully and filed it away. The second baby arrived 15 minutes later. A girl smaller than her brother, but she came in announcing herself to Wyoming with an outrage entirely disproportionate to her size, and I laughed through my tears at the sheer indignant volume of her. Colt settled both of them against my chest. Then he stepped back to the far corner of the cabin and turned to face the wall. He gave me that. In the middle of everything, he thought to give me that. I looked down at 2 impossibly small faces, wrinkled and red and perfect, and I felt the full weight of what I'd been carrying for 6 months shift and redistribute itself into something I could actually hold. Ellie said quietly, "The boy is James, after my father." Colt said, "Not after your husband?" Ellie said, "No." He did not ask why. That told me something important about him. Ellie said, "The girl is Rosalind, Roz, after my grandmother." Colt said, "Good names, strong names." We were quiet for a while after that. The storm drummed on. The stove ticked and popped as it warmed the small space. James made a sound against my chest, like a question, and Roz answered it from the other side, and I thought, we are going to be all right. All 3 of us. We are going to be all right. Colt sat at the table with his back to me for the rest of the night. He kept the fire going. He answered my questions when I asked them, and stayed quiet when I did not. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, I asked him how long he had been working the territory, and he said 5 years. And I asked him what he did before that, and he said detective work. And I asked for who, and he said the Pinkerton Agency. The name landed in the quiet cabin like a stone dropped in still water. Ellie said, "Past tense?" Colt said, "Past tense, 2 years ago." Ellie said, "Why did you leave?" A long pause. Colt said, "I made a mistake that couldn't be unmade." I heard what was underneath those words. A man who had done something he could not forgive himself for. I had been married to a man who never felt guilty about anything in his life. The contrast was not lost on me. I filed that away too. When morning came and weak light pushed through the grimy window, Colt had already gone out to repair the wagon wheel. I discovered this when I woke and looked outside and saw him working in the pale gold of early morning, methodical and quiet, his breath steaming in the cold air. He had been up all night. When I came to the door, he looked up. Ellie said, "You didn't sleep." Colt said, "Someone had to keep the fire." I moved to step down from the cabin doorway. He came to help, offered his arm, which I took. And as I did, my hand brushed his holster. Empty, not just undrawn, empty. No weapon at all. I looked up at him. He met my eyes without explanation. He had called my bluff in the first minute of our acquaintance. He had not been armed the entire time. The corner of his mouth moved, just barely. Not quite a smile, but something. I thought about that almost smile for the rest of the drive to Harlow Creek. Harlow Creek announced itself with wood smoke and the smell of livestock and the sound of a hammer somewhere on the far side of the main street. It was a rough town, one long street of false-fronted buildings, 2 saloons, a general store, a telegraph office, a boarding house painted white that I recognized from Vera's descriptions. Population 340, most of whom seemed to be standing in the street watching us arrive. Vera was out the door before the wagon stopped. She was 31 and looked like me if I had been left out in Wyoming weather for 7 years. Same auburn hair, same green eyes, same set to the jaw that our father used to call the Callahan stubbornness. She pulled me off the wagon seat and held me at arm's length and looked at my face and then at the 2 bundles against my chest, and her expression cycled through approximately 9 emotions in 4 seconds. Vera said, "Twins." "You didn't tell me twins." Ellie said, "I wrote you a letter." Vera said, "I never got a letter. The last I heard from you was 2 months ago saying you were coming." Ellie said, "Then we have a great deal to talk about." Vera looked past me to Colt, still sitting on his horse. The look that passed between them was not the look of strangers. There was history there. Not warm history, but known history. The kind between people who have been aware of each other for a long time without being close. Vera said, "Mackenzie." Colt said, "Mrs. Callahan, your sister needs rest and the babies need a doctor." Vera said, "Doc Harriet is 3 doors down. I'll get her." She hustled us inside before I could ask how she knew him. Doc Harriet Crane was 52 years old, built like a woman who had been arguing with the world since birth and winning most of the arguments. And she examined James and Roz with the brisk competence of someone who had seen worse and wasn't going to pretend otherwise just to spare my feelings. Doc Harriet said, 6 weeks early, maybe a little more, but they're breathing clean and they're nursing. That's what matters right now. Keep them warm, feed them often, watch for fever. If they make it through the first week, they've got a real chance. Ellie said, "They'll make it." Doc Harriet looked at me over her spectacles. Doc Harriet said, "Good. Hold on to that." The next morning, while Vera watched the babies, I went to the general store, not for supplies, for information. The store owner's wife was a talker, the kind of woman who considers the distribution of local knowledge a community service. And I spent 40 minutes buying cloth for infant wrappings and asking careful questions about the territory, about land ownership, about history, about anyone who had arrived with nothing and built a great deal very quickly. The picture she painted was not a comfortable one. Douglas Holt had come to the territory 18 years ago. Within 3 years, he owned more land than any other man in the county. Some of the families who sold to him had been glad to sell. Others had needed considerable persuasion. A few had experienced unfortunate accidents before Holt made his offer. Nobody said this out loud in town. I was thinking about that when Colt found me at the counter. He looked at the small amount of cloth I had purchased, and then at the expression on my face. Colt said, "You weren't here for cloth." Ellie said, "I was also here for cloth." He almost smiled. Almost. Colt said, "What did you find out?" Ellie said, "That I was right to keep the box." He didn't ask about the box. I noticed that he never asked about the box, even though he had obviously seen it. That restraint told me more about him than a question would have. We were walking back toward the boarding house when I saw her. She was standing outside the telegraph office, the most deliberately beautiful woman I had ever seen in a frontier town, which is saying something because frontier towns are not known for producing effortless elegance. Fair-haired, composed, dressed with a care that suggested she knew exactly what she was doing at all times. She put her hand on Colt's arm with the ease of someone who had done it many times before. May said, "Colt, I heard you rode in with company." Her eyes moved to me, not hostile, measuring, the look of a woman assessing a situation rather than a rival, though I did not know the difference yet. Colt said, "Miss Whitfield, this is Ellie Callahan, Vera's sister." May said, "Welcome to Harlow Creek, Mrs. Callahan. I hope you're planning to stay a while." That evening, from the boarding house window, I watched them talking in the street below. Easy with each other, comfortable. The way people are when they have a long history and have decided what it means. I told myself I did not care. That was the first lie I told myself in Harlow Creek. It would not be the last. That night, after the babies were settled, Vera sat across from me at the kitchen table and said the things she had been working up to since I arrived. Vera said, "Did anyone follow you from Salt Lake?" Ellie said, "I don't think so. But Thomas had information about someone powerful. I think that's why he died." Vera went quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that means a person is deciding how much to say. Ellie said, "Vera, what do you know?" Vera said, "I know Douglas Holt has run this town for 15 years and no one crosses him. I know 3 people who tried are buried in the county cemetery." She stopped, started again. "I know your father's name is on a land deed in Holt's office. Land that should have come to us when he died." The kitchen went very cold. Vera said, "Don't let Colt Mackenzie get too close." Ellie said, "Why?" Vera said, "Because good men in this town have a short life expectancy." The next morning, Douglas Holt rode into Harlow Creek with 3 armed riders and found me on the main street as though by accident. He was not what I expected. I had built him into something monstrous in my mind over the years since my father's death, and monsters are easier to face when they look like monsters. Douglas Holt was 60, silver-haired, impeccably dressed for a cattle baron in a rough territory. He spoke softly. He smiled with practice. Holt said, "Eleanor, what a remarkable surprise. All this way from Salt Lake and with children, I hear. Thomas would have been so proud." Ellie said, "Thomas is dead, Douglas." Holt said, "Yes, tragic. The territory can be so unforgiving." He let that sit for exactly the right amount of time. "You're staying at your sister's boarding house. We'll have to sit down soon and discuss the property matters your late husband left unsettled. You're within my land boundary here, you know, legally speaking." He tipped his hat, rode away. Colt was 20 steps behind me. He walked to my side and said nothing. He could see my hands shaking. My face had not moved. That evening he knocked on my door. Colt said, "What is Douglas Holt to you?" I opened the door and looked at him. Ellie said, "He's the man who had my father killed." The days settled into a rhythm that surprised me with its ordinariness. Vera's boarding house had 3 other guests: a surveyor, a traveling merchant, and a retired army sergeant who kept mostly to his room. And I helped where I could, carrying laundry and minding the front desk while Vera cooked. The babies slept in a drawer lined with blankets that Doc Harriet had declared perfectly adequate for the purpose. Colt came every morning. He said he was checking on the babies. He checked on the babies for approximately 4 minutes each visit and stayed for 2 hours. I did not point this out. The third morning he picked up James and held him wrong. Too stiff, arms at the wrong angle, the particular awkwardness of a man who has never held something this small and is terrified of breaking it. I moved his arms without asking permission, adjusted the angle, showed him where to put his hand to support the head. Ellie said, "There, now he can breathe properly." Colt looked down at James, who had gone still and watchful in the new position, studying this unfamiliar face with the serious expression that was already becoming distinctly his own. Colt said, "He's looking at me like he's deciding something." Ellie said, "He probably is. He does that." The next morning, Colt came in and picked up James correctly. He had practiced. I could tell by the way the adjustment had become muscle memory overnight. Something about that quiet effort, the fact that he had gone home and worked on it alone so he could do better, that hit me somewhere I was not prepared for it to hit. I said nothing, but I noticed. Doc Harriet found me on the back porch 4 days into my stay and sat down without being invited. Doc Harriet said, You want to know about Colt Mackenzie? Ellie said, I didn't ask. Doc Harriet said, You've been asking around town about everything else. You haven't asked about him. That means you're either not interested, which your face says is wrong, or you're afraid of what you'll find. She told me. The Pinkerton years, the fugitive chase through an alley in Laramie, the boy who stepped out at the wrong moment, the shot that could not be taken back. William Whitfield, 16 years old, dead before the echo finished. Doc Harriet said, He handed in his badge and his gun that same afternoon, drove 3 days west and never went back. He hasn't drawn a weapon since. Considers it the only appropriate response. I sat with that for a long time. I'd been married to a man who used his fists to feel powerful, and never once considered that he had done anything wrong. I had never imagined a man who would punish himself so thoroughly, so permanently, for a mistake made in bad light and bad timing. That night I opened the wooden box by candlelight. The documents inside told a story I had been piecing together for 16 years. Thomas had been clever enough to find what I never had, a letter, in Douglas Holt's own handwriting, instructing a man named Roy Greer to handle the matter of Patrick Callahan. Those were the exact words, handle the matter, written 3 weeks before my father's death. The land deed transfer happened 6 months later, arranged through my father's brother, who I had not spoken to since I was 12 years old and now understood why. Thomas had found this letter and used it to extort money from Holt for 4 years. Thomas had known who killed my father. He had known for 4 years, and he had used it as a business arrangement, and he had never told me. I sat with that for a long time, too. Late that night, both babies woke simultaneously, which they had begun doing with a coordination that suggested they had been planning it. I was managing James when I heard footsteps on the stairs, quiet, unhurried, and then Colt appeared in the doorway without knocking. He crossed the room and picked up Roz without a word. He held her correctly. He had been practicing that, too. We sat in the dark together for an hour. He hummed something low and formless. Not quite a song, more like a reassurance directed at no one in particular. Roz settled against his chest. James fell back asleep in my arms. I looked at this man in the dark, and I thought about what it meant that he had come up without being asked, and sat in the quiet without needing to be thanked for it, and I understood that I was in a great deal of trouble. He left before dawn. I heard his boots on the stairs. I lay in the dark, listening to my children breathe, and told myself I was not going to make decisions based on feelings that had been activated by exhaustion and gratitude and 6 months of being utterly alone. Then I saw it from the window. Finn Mackenzie, Colt's younger brother who had arrived 2 days ago and charmed every woman in the building within an hour, was standing in the alley behind the saloon, speaking quietly to one of Holt's armed riders. Close, easy, the posture of men who know each other well. I closed the curtain. I did not tell Colt. I told myself it was because I did not know enough yet. That was partly true. The other part was that I did not know how to hand him something that might break him without being certain it was real. I held on to that justification for exactly 3 more weeks. October came in gently, which in Wyoming is a trick the land plays on you before it shows you what winter actually means. The grasslands went gold and amber. The mountains to the west turned white at the peaks, while the lower slopes stayed green. The town of Harlow Creek stacked firewood and moved cattle to winter pasture, and settled into the particular industrious piece of a community preparing for cold. Holt did not come back. Finn did nothing I could identify as suspicious. The babies gained weight steadily. Doc Harriet weighed them every 3 days, and each time her expression softened slightly, which from her was the equivalent of celebration. Colt and I fell into something that looked from the outside like a domestic arrangement. Morning coffee in Vera's kitchen. The babies passed between us with the ease of people who had been doing it for years. Conversations that started about practical things and ended somewhere neither of us had intended to go. I let myself begin, carefully and against my better judgment, to imagine this lasting. On a clear afternoon in the third week, Colt drove us out to the ridge east of town. Good visibility in all directions, the Bighorn Peaks white against a hard blue sky. He lifted James and I carried Roz, and we stood at the top of the ridge and looked at Wyoming, spreading out below us in all its vast and indifferent beauty. Colt said, "Do you miss Ireland?" Ellie said, "I miss the idea of it. I left when I was 8. The real place is probably ordinary." Colt said, "I've never been to Scotland. My grandfather came over. Sometimes I think I should go, and then I think what I'm looking for probably isn't there." Ellie said, "What are you looking for?" He was quiet for a moment. Colt said, "I used to think I was looking for something to do penance with. Work that was hard enough to count." A pause. "Lately, I think I might be looking for something else." The space between us had closed by several inches. Neither of us had moved deliberately. It had simply happened, the way things happen when two people stop paying attention to the distance. Colt said, "Ellie, you didn't ask me about the boy I shot." Ellie said, "Doc Harriet told me." Colt said, "And you're not afraid of me?" Ellie said, "I'm afraid of men who hurt people and feel nothing afterward." "You have been punishing yourself for 2 years for a mistake made in bad light during a lawful chase. That's not the same category." He turned to look at me fully. Something in his expression had opened up. Some careful arrangement he usually kept in place had shifted, and what was underneath it was simpler and more exposed than anything he had shown me before. Then hoofbeats, below us on the road. 4 riders, Finn in front. Behind him, a man in judge's robes and 2 of Holt's armed men. Judge Boone presented a court order with the smooth efficiency of a man who has served papers he knew were fraudulent before. I was to appear before the territorial court in 5 days. Thomas's outstanding debts, creditors' claims, guardianship of minor children potentially subject to territorial statute pending debt resolution. I read the document without expression. I had been expecting something like this, though not this exactly. Colt took the paper from my hands, read it, handed it back. Then he turned to his brother. Colt said, "How long have you known about this?" Finn said nothing for too long. Colt said, "Finn, how long have you been working for Holt?" Finn admitted it in pieces. The debt their father had left, 4 years of interest. Holt's offer to forgive it in exchange for information. He said he hadn't known Holt was going to use the courts. He thought he was just reporting on Ellie's whereabouts. Colt said, "You thought that made it better?" Finn had no answer. Colt turned to me. His voice was level, his eyes were not. Colt said, "What did you know about Finn that you didn't tell me?" Ellie said, "I saw him in the alley with Holt's man 3 weeks ago." The silence was worse than anything he could have said. Colt said, "You didn't trust me." Ellie said, "I didn't know you well enough." Colt said, "And now?" I had an answer. I didn't give it to him because I was about to, and then he walked away, back down the ridge toward his horse without another word. First time in the 3 weeks I had known him that he left instead of staying. I stood on the ridge with 2 babies and the court order and watched him go, and felt something cold settle in my chest that had nothing to do with the October wind. That evening, Vera sat down across from me and said, "There's something I've been sitting on for 3 years." Ellie said, "Tell me." Vera said, "The man Holt hired to kill Father. His name was Roy Greer. He died 18 months ago, about 40 miles east of here. Before he died, he wrote out a confession. Everything he knew, everything Holt told him, the payment he received. He gave it to me because I was the only person he thought Holt would never suspect." The kitchen went very quiet. Ellie said, "You've had a confession for 18 months. Vera said, "I was waiting for the right moment. I was waiting for you." My sister had been sitting 600 miles away from me, terrified, holding the second half of the case against Douglas Holt, waiting for me to arrive with the first half. We had both been carrying pieces of the same truth, neither of us knowing the other had any of it. I held on to that. the strange, awful symmetry of it, and started thinking about what to do next. We laid everything on the kitchen table. Vera's confession from Roy Greer, the documents from my box, Holt's letter ordering my father's death, the fraudulent land deed, 4 years of payment records from Thomas's extortion arrangement. Doc Harriet sat with us because I trusted her, and because she had a practical mind, and I needed practical minds around me. Together, the documents told a complete story. Douglas Holt had ordered my father killed 16 years ago because Patrick Callahan would not sell his land. A man named Roy Greer had carried it out for payment. Holt had acquired the land 6 months later through a sale arranged with my father's brother. Thomas had discovered the letter, recognized its value, and spent 4 years collecting money from Holt instead of justice for the man who had been my father. It was enough to hang Douglas Holt. It was also enough to make him dangerous in ways he had not yet been. Doc Harriet said, "You need to get this to a federal judge, not Boone, someone from Cheyenne who Holt doesn't own." Ellie said, "The territorial court date is in 3 days." Doc Harriet said, "Then you need to stall, and you need to be very careful between now and then." Colt came back that night. I heard him on the stairs at 10 o'clock, and my heart did something complicated that I chose not to examine closely. He knocked. I opened the door. He looked at me for a moment. Colt said, "I shouldn't have walked away." Ellie said, "I should have told you about Finn." Colt said, "Yes, but I understand why you didn't." A pause. "I went to find him." Ellie said, "What did he say?" Colt said, "That he had no options. That the debt was real and Holt was holding it and he didn't see another way." Ellie said, "What did you say?" Colt said, "That he always had options, and that I'd already paid the debt." Ellie said, "You paid it? When?" Colt said, 3 weeks ago. Sent a letter to the bank in Cheyenne. It's cleared." Ellie said, "Why didn't you tell him?" Colt said, "Because I wanted to know who he was when he thought he had no choice." I looked at this man standing in my doorway. A man who paid his brother's debt in secret to test his brother's character, and felt the careful walls I had built start doing something structurally unsound. Then Roz made a sound that was not her usual sound. Doc Harriet came at midnight. Fever. With premature infants, fever in the first months is not a warning, it is a crisis. We moved quickly, cool cloths and careful monitoring, Doc Harriet checking Roz's breathing every 15 minutes with an expression she was working to keep neutral. Colt stood in the hallway outside the closed door. He stood there for 4 hours. At 2 in the morning, I opened the door and found him there. Not pacing, not leaning against the wall trying to look casual, simply standing, present. Ellie said, "You don't have to stay." Colt said, "I know." We sat in the hallway together in the dark. Not touching, not talking. 2 people who had decided that being there was the only thing that mattered right now. At 5 in the morning, I went back in to check on Roz, and her fever had broken. She was sleeping with her fist pressed against her cheek, breathing steadily, small chest rising and falling with a regularity that made me feel like I could breathe again, too. I came back to the hallway to tell Colt. He was asleep in the chair he had pulled from the landing, head tipped back, completely unconscious. He looked younger when he slept, less weathered, less carefully assembled. I put a blanket over him and went to make coffee. The message arrived with a boy from the telegraph office before 8 in the morning. No signature. But I recognized the careful handwriting from letters Thomas had shown me once, pointing out how controlled it was. "Deliver the box to my man at the north end of town by sundown. If you do not, Finn Mackenzie will be arrested for the murder of a cattle hand found outside Laramie last spring. The evidence exists. I made sure of it. You have until dark. I read it twice, folded it, put it in my pocket. I did not show it to Colt. I told myself I was protecting him. I knew underneath that that I was also still, after everything, after all of it, trying to solve my own problems alone. It was the only way I had ever known how to survive, and the habit was deep. By late afternoon, I had made my decision. The box under my arm, wrapped in the flour sack, I walked toward the north end of town. I told myself it was the only way. Finn would go to prison for something Holt had manufactured. Colt would lose his brother. The case against Holt was strong, but it required time I might not have, and people I could not guarantee. I was 50 yards from Holt's man when I heard Colt's voice behind me. Colt said, "Ellie." I stopped, did not turn around. Colt said, "Don't." Ellie said, "If I don't, Finn goes to prison." He was beside me then. He turned me to face him, both hands on my shoulders, gentle and certain. Colt said, "Show me the note." I gave it to him. He read it, looked up. Colt said, "You were going to do this alone." Ellie said, "I do everything alone." Colt said, "Not anymore." He said it so simply, with so little ceremony, that it hit me harder than anything dramatic could have. Colt said, "Ellie, you've been carrying everything since before I met you. I'm standing right here. Let me stand here." I thought about Thomas, who had known who killed my father and used it for money. I thought about the 8 years before that, learning that needing someone was the same as giving them power over you. I thought about the girl who had driven across Wyoming alone because she had decided, somewhere along the way, that alone was the only safe way to be. I looked at Colt Mackenzie standing in the dirt road in October light, and I thought, this is a different kind of man. And you know it. I did not give Holt's man the box. The 5 of us gathered around Vera's kitchen table before dawn. Colt, Finn, Vera, Doc Harriet, and me. Outside, Harlow Creek was still dark and quiet. Inside, we laid out what we had and what we needed. Doc Harriet said, "The documents need to reach a federal judge in Cheyenne, not Boone. A real judge with no connection to Holt." Finn said, "That's a 5-day round trip minimum." Colt said, "We have 3 days before Boone's court date." They looked at me. I reached into my traveling trunk and brought out an oilskin packet folded and sealed. Ellie said, "The night before I left Salt Lake, I copied every document in the box by hand, word for word. Then I mailed the copies to the editor of the Wyoming Tribune in Cheyenne with a letter explaining what they contained and who was responsible." Silence around the table. Ellie said, "I did it before I arrived here, before I knew any of you." Colt said, "So the newspaper already has copies of everything." Ellie said, "I don't know if they'll print it, but Holt doesn't know they have it, which means we have more time than he thinks we do." Doc Harriet made a sound that, from her, constituted high praise. Colt looked at me across the table, not surprised exactly, but something adjacent to it. Like a man who thought he had taken the measure of a situation and is realizing the situation had more dimensions than he accounted for. Colt said, "You did that before you trusted anyone here." Ellie said, "I do everything alone." Colt said, "Not anymore." He said it again. I was starting to understand that when Colt Mackenzie repeated himself, it was not because he had forgotten he'd said it before. It was because he meant it to land differently the second time. It did. Finn said he would ride to Cheyenne himself with the originals. It was the least he could offer, he said, and he said it to the table rather than to his brother, which told me the conversation between them the night before had not been easy or finished. Colt said, "You don't have to." Finn said, "I know. That's why I'm doing it." May Whitfield appeared at the boarding house door that afternoon and asked to speak to me alone. I said yes, partly because I respected directness, mostly because 3 weeks of watching her and Colt exist comfortably in each other's orbit had produced a low-grade discomfort I was tired of pretending wasn't there. She sat down across from me in Vera's parlor and spoke without preamble. May said, I am not what you think I am where Colt is concerned. Ellie said, What do I think? May said, That we were together, or close to it. Neither of us corrected that assumption because it was useful. For him. Because it kept people from pressing him on things he couldn't talk about. For me, because... She stopped. My father's name was William Whitfield. The room went completely still. May said, I came here 2 years ago. I told myself I wanted to confront Colt. I watched him for a month before I spoke to him. I watched him give his pay to a widow whose husband died on the Bar W. I watched him sit outside a sick child's house all night because the mother had no one. I watched him refuse to draw a weapon when a drunk man pulled on him outside the saloon. She paused. My father stepped out of an alley during a fugitive chase. Colt couldn't have known. He has understood that for 2 years, and it hasn't made it lighter. Ellie said, Have you told him you forgive him? May said, I'm telling you first. Because you need to know who he is before you decide what to do about it. A pause. He loves you. He hasn't said it yet, but anyone with eyes can see it. After she left, I sat in the parlor for a long time. Then I went to find Colt. He was at the livery checking his horse. I stood in the doorway and he turned and looked at me. And I thought about every careful thing I had told myself about not making decisions based on exhaustion and gratitude and fear of being alone. And then I crossed the distance between us and kissed him. Not impulsive. Decided. The kiss of a woman who has thought it through and made her choice. He went still for 1 second, the stillness of a man who is making sure this is real. And then he kissed me back with the quiet thoroughness of someone who has been holding something in for a long time and is finally, carefully letting it go. When we stepped back from each other, he looked at me the way he had looked at me on the ridge. Everything open, nothing withheld. Colt said, Ellie? Ellie said, I know. One thing at a time. Colt said, Yes. But he was almost smiling when he said it. Not almost, actually. He was smiling, the first full smile I had seen from him, and it changed his whole face, and I stored the memory of it like something valuable. That night, alone in his room, he opened the trunk at the foot of his bed. The Colt 45 was at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth. He had not touched it in 2 years. He unwrapped it, cleaned it by lamplight, checked the mechanism. Then he put it in the holster on the chair and blew out the lamp. This was not violence. This was a man deciding to be present in the world again, to stop punishing himself with absence and take up the space he had been given. The gun going back into the holster was not a threat. It was a declaration. Judge Boone's courtroom was the back room of the land office building, which told you something about how seriously the territory took its judiciary. 12 wooden chairs for spectators, a raised desk for the judge, 2 tables facing each other for petitioner and respondent. I sat at the respondent's table in my best dress, which was not very best after 3 days in a wagon and 6 weeks in a Wyoming boarding house, and I kept my hands flat on the table so no one could see whether they were steady. Colt was in the back row. He had told me he would be there, and he was there, and that was exactly what he had said it would be. Simple and present and without condition. Holt was at the petitioner's table, composed as a man who has already won. Boone began his prepared ruling. I let him get 3 sentences in. Then I stood up and placed the wooden box on his desk. Ellie said, Before this court issues any ruling, Your Honor, I am presenting evidence of criminal conspiracy by a party present in this room. Holt rose. Holt said, Those documents are fabricated by a grieving widow who... Colt said, Sit down, Douglas. From the back of the room. Quiet as a door closing. The room went silent. Even Holt sat down. Boone opened the box with the reluctance of a man who already suspected what was inside. He read the first document, then the second. The color left his face page by page, the way water drains from a pan. Because the box did not only contain Holt's letter ordering my father's death, it also contained a bill of payment, money transferred for land management services, signed by both Holt and Aldrich Boone 1 week after Patrick Callahan died. Boone looked up. He looked at Holt. Boone said, "You told me this evidence was destroyed." Holt said, "Aldrich," Boone said, "you told me it was handled." In the confusion of Boone rising and his voice climbing and 2 of Holt's men moving for their weapons, Douglas Holt walked out the back door. He was gone before anyone reached it. The courtroom erupted. Boone was shouting. Holt's riders were uncertain without their employer's direction. Colt was already moving toward the back, but the alley was empty by the time he got there. Holt was free. Boone was in custody, weeping and already composing an explanation that cast himself as a victim. And somewhere outside Harlow Creek, a very dangerous man was deciding what to do about a woman who had just put his entire life in front of a judge. The message came an hour later, delivered by a rider to Vera's front door, addressed to me, no signature needed. "Meet me at the North Ridge alone, or I will burn this building with your sister and children inside." Finn intercepted the rider and brought the note to Colt before it reached me, which is how all 6 of us ended up riding for the North Ridge at dusk. Colt, Finn, Vera, Doc Harriet with a shotgun she had produced from under the front desk, and me in the wagon, and May, who had appeared in the yard with a rifle, and said simply that she was coming, and nobody had argued with her. Holt was at the ridge with 1 man. He had expected to see me alone. He did not adjust his expression when he saw the rest of them. He was too controlled for that. But something shifted in his eyes. Holt said, "This isn't finished, Eleanor." Ellie said, "Check the front page of the Wyoming Tribune. It is." The composure cracked, just slightly, just enough. Holt said, "What did you do?" Ellie said, "I wrote to a newspaper before I arrived in Harlow Creek. Everything in that box, and a dying man's written confession naming you by name, went to the editor of the Wyoming Tribune 3 weeks ago. This morning it's in print. Copies are already on their way to the territorial governor and the United States Marshal's office." From the tree line behind Holt, 3 men on horseback emerged wearing federal badges. Colt had sent for the marshal 10 days ago, not 3 miles. 10. He had been running a longer plan than anyone knew. When I looked at him, he met my eyes without apology. Holt's 1 remaining man put his hands up without being asked. Holt stood very still for a moment, looking at me. Holt said, "Your father was a stubborn man." Ellie said, "Yes, I inherited it." They put the cuffs on him. He walked past me without another word. I watched them take him down the ridge, and I felt something loosen in my chest that had been held tight for 16 years. Tight as a locked box, sealed against everything that hurt, maintained by the effort of not letting it show. My father's name would be cleared. The land would come back. Roy Greer's confession and Holt's own handwriting would see to both. I became aware that I was crying only when Colt appeared beside me and put his arm around my shoulders. I let him. The week after Holt's arrest moved at the pace of aftermath. Slow, necessary, full of the unglamorous work of things actually being finished rather than just decided. Holt and Boone were transported to Cheyenne under federal escort. The Wyoming Tribune story ran on the front page for 3 consecutive days. The territorial governor ordered a full audit of every land transfer in the county going back 15 years, which made a number of people in Harlow Creek nervous and a number of others relieved. Doc Harriet weighed the babies and announced, with what amounted to jubilation in her particular register, that both were now above 5 pounds and gaining steadily. Roz's fever was completely resolved. James had developed the habit of grabbing whatever finger came within reach and holding it with a grip that Doc Harriet said was a very good sign neurologically. I stood in the doorway of their room one morning and watched them sleep. 2 small people who had arrived 6 weeks early in a storm in a Wyoming trapper's cabin and had decided, apparently, to stay. And I let myself believe it completely. Not provisionally. Not with the one eye open I had been keeping for months. All the way. Then I asked Vera to watch them, and I walked to the cemetery. My father's grave was in the back corner, a plain marker that Vera had been tending for 3 years. I had not known it was here until she told me. She had found it 2 years after he died, paid for the stone herself, kept the ground clear of weeds. I stood at the marker for a while without speaking. Then I did. I told him I had found out what happened. I told him it was finished. I told him about the Tribune story and the federal charges and Roy Greer's confession that had been sitting in Vera's keeping all this time. I told him I was sorry it had taken 16 years and that I had been 8 years old, and there was nothing I could have done, and that I had needed a long time to understand that. Then I told him about James and Roz, about Wyoming in October, about a man with storm-gray eyes who had almost ridden past a broken wagon wheel and decided against it. I told my father I was happy. I said the words out loud for the first time in my adult life, and felt them land true. I put a small stone on top of the marker, an Irish custom my grandmother had explained to me once, for letting the dead know the living came by, and walked back to town. Colt was waiting outside the boarding house. He had not followed me to the cemetery. He had let me go alone, which was the right call, and he had known it was the right call without being told. He had a folded paper in his hand. He placed it on the porch rail between us. It was a land deed. 40 acres on the eastern edge of the Harlow Creek Valley, a rise above a creek. Cottonwoods on the north side. Good water, good grass, the kind of ground that builds into something if you work it. Ellie said, "When did you buy this?" Colt said, 3 weeks after I brought you to Harlow Creek. Ellie said, "That was before you knew any of it, before the box, before Holt, before—" Colt said, "Yes." Ellie said, "Why?" He looked at me with the uncomplicated directness of a man who has stopped protecting himself from his own feelings. Colt said, "Because I needed a reason to stay, and you were the reason." I had prepared in some part of my mind some version of a careful response, something measured, something that acknowledged the complications and the history and the sensible reasons to proceed slowly. I did not deliver it. Ellie said, "Colt Mackenzie, I am a 24-year-old widow with 2 premature babies, no money beyond what my sister gives me, and enough history to fill a book that nobody would believe. You understand what you're considering?" Colt said, "I do." Ellie said, "And you're certain?" Colt said, "I've been certain since the night I sat outside your door in the hallway, not knowing why I couldn't leave." I took 1 step toward him. Ellie said, "You are going to have to learn to hold 2 babies at once." Colt said, "I've been practicing." He raised both arms, James in his left, Roz in his right. Each baby settled securely, both of them asleep. Both of them held with the careful confidence of a man who had worked at it quietly and alone until he got it right. I laughed. The first full, unguarded laugh I had produced in longer than I could remember. It surprised me with its own volume, and I did not try to stop it. Colt was smiling when the laugh faded. Fully. The real one. The one that changed his whole face. Ellie said, "Yes." Colt said, "I haven't asked yet." Ellie said, "You were about to, yes." He pulled me in with both babies between us, which is not the most elegant arrangement for a moment like this, but it was exactly right. They say Wyoming can kill a person 3 ways. What they do not tell you is the 4th. It can save you. We were married in April of 1884. On a clear morning when the cottonwood trees on the north side of our 40 acres were putting out their first leaves, tiny and pale green, and impossibly hopeful, the way new things always are. The ceremony was small. Vera stood beside me, and Doc Harriet, who wore her best coat and managed to look almost festive. Finn stood with Colt, a little solemn, working through something that would take longer than 1 morning but had genuinely started. May held both babies, one on each hip, completely at ease with it, and when Roz grabbed a fistful of her hair, she just kept talking to James like nothing had happened. I wore a dress the color of new sage, not black, not white, the color of things that have decided to grow again. The federal justice who had ridden in from Cheyenne read the words, When he got to the part about what we promised each other, Colt spoke his vows without notes. Colt said, "I will show up. Every morning, every hard season, every night things go wrong. I will show up and I will stay. That is my vow." I said, "I spent a long time learning to survive alone. I would like to spend the rest of my life learning that I don't have to." There was a pause after that, a quiet that felt less like absence and more like a room that has just been filled with something good. We built the house ourselves through spring and summer, Colt and Finn doing the heavy framing, Vera managing the supply orders with the efficiency of a woman who has been running a household in a frontier town for 7 years. I made every decision about the interior with the specificity of someone who has thought for a long time about what home means and is finally in a position to build one. Kitchen window facing east. Morning light. I mentioned once in passing that I had grown up in a house with a bookshelf and had missed having one. I mentioned it once in a conversation about something else and did not think of it again. When the front room was finished, there was a bookshelf on the north wall. Colt had built it himself, planed and jointed and fitted with the same quiet attention he gave to everything he decided mattered. I stood in front of it for a long moment. Ellie said, "I only mentioned that once." Colt said, "I know." Ellie said, "Months ago." Colt said, "I know." That was all he said. He did not make a production of it. He had done it because I wanted it, and he had been paying attention. And those were reasons enough. The babies turned 1 in September. They had transformed from the frightening fragility of their first weeks into 2 small people with distinct and opinionated personalities. James watchful and serious, studying everything around him before committing to a response, and Roz loud and delighted by the world, laughing at things the rest of us could not identify, reaching for everything in reach. Colt taught them both to wave at the horses. He would hold one on each hip and walk them to the corral fence, and the horses would come. And James would observe with great seriousness, and Roz would shriek with enthusiasm. And Colt would stand there between them with an expression I came to think of as his real face, the one under the careful, weathered exterior, open and steady and glad. On an October morning, exactly 1 year after the storm, Colt drove us out to the eastern road. He pulled up on a slight rise and set the brake, and we looked at the stretch of grass and sky where a wheel had broken, and a woman had stood in the rain with a gun, and an impossible situation, and said, "Not yet." The bighorn peaks were already white. The valley below us was gold and brown, and the creek was visible from up here, a silver line threading through the cottonwoods. Our land, our creek, our trees. Ellie said, "I was so afraid that morning." Colt said, "I know." Ellie said, "I had a gun pointed at you within 30 seconds of meeting you." Colt said, "You did." Ellie said, "And you stayed." Colt said, "Seemed like the right call." Behind us in the wagon bed, James made a sound at the sky. Not words yet, but something intentional, something directed upward at the wide October blue. Roz answered him immediately in her own language, equally certain, equally emphatic. They had been having conversations like this for months. I had stopped trying to interpret them. I looked at the road running west toward Harlow Creek. Then I looked at Colt. Ellie said, "I love you." I had not said it plainly before. Not like this, with nothing attached to it, no condition or qualifier. Just the fact. He went still the way he had on the first day, the stillness of a man who is making sure something is real before he trusts it. Colt said, "I know." Ellie said, "You know?" Colt said, "I've known since you handed me the box, the way you gave it over, like it was the most valuable thing you owned." He looked at me. It was. He pulled me against him, and I let him, and behind us both children made sounds of strong opinion about something in the October sky, and the horses stood patient in the gold light, and the creek ran silver through our cottonwoods below. I had left Salt Lake City with a gun and a locked box and 2 babies who were not supposed to come for 6 more weeks, and I had been running because running was the only thing I knew how to do. and a wheel had broken on an empty road in Wyoming, and a man had almost ridden past and then had not. My father's name was cleared. His land came back to me and Vera, worked into the 40 acres we had built on, part of the ground our children would grow up on. Roy Greer's confession and Holt's own handwriting had ensured that. Holt would stand trial in Cheyenne in the spring, and the federal prosecutor had told us the evidence was thorough. We would not need to go. It was finished. This was what remained. This view from this ridge, this man beside me, these two small people conducting their important conversation with the Wyoming sky. That evening I wrote the letter I had been composing in my head for months. To my father's sister in County Clare. The first letter I had sent to Ireland in 8 years. I told her about Wyoming, about the way the light falls in October, gold and clean and long across the grasslands. About a boarding house in a rough town and a sister who had been keeping a grave tended and a secret waiting, both of them, for the right moment. About a man who delivered twins in a trapper's cabin during a storm and quietly paid his brother's debts, and built a bookshelf because someone mentioned it once. I told her that Patrick Callahan's daughters were well, that his grandchildren were named James and Rosalind, and were conducting experiments daily into the structural properties of everything within reach. The last lines I read to Colt on the porch after the children were asleep, by the light of the lantern, with Wyoming spread out dark and enormous around our 40 acres. Ellie read, "I thought I was running away. I understand now that I was running toward the thing I needed most, ground that doesn't shift under your feet every time you breathe." Wyoming is nothing like Ireland. It is harder and stranger, and the winters are not to be believed. But it is home now. He is home now. I am telling you this so you know that we are well. We found our way. Colt was quiet for a moment. Colt said, "That's a good letter." Ellie said, "It's a true letter." He took my hand. We sat on the porch of the house we had built and listened to Wyoming settle into night around us. Wind in the cottonwoods, cattle somewhere to the east, an owl in the dark above the creek. We were not lucky. I want to be clear about that, because luck suggests something that happened to us, and what happened to us was also built, day by day, choice by choice, the unglamorous accumulation of two people deciding every morning to be present and honest and here. We were stubborn, and we were careful, and we chose each other on a day when the sky fell in. That was enough. That has always been enough. The storm that found me on an empty road in Wyoming gave me everything I had stopped believing was possible. A place to put down roots, a man worth trusting, a family built not from the absence of hardship, but straight through the middle of it. James and Rosalind Callahan Mackenzie would grow up on this land, knowing where they came from, and who had fought for them before they had words for any of it. They would know their grandfather's name and the story of how it was cleared. They would know about the wooden box and the locked secret and the storm and the rider who came down the ridge. And someday, when they were old enough to understand what it means to be afraid and act anyway, I would sit with them on this porch and tell them the rest. I would tell them that Wyoming can kill a person 3 ways: the cold, the loneliness, and the secrets the land buries. And then I would tell them the 4th way, the way nobody mentions because it is harder to explain and easier to miss if you are not paying attention. Wyoming can save you too. All it takes is a storm at the right moment, and one person willing to ride down from a ridge instead of around. All elements within this narrative are fictional and crafted for storytelling purposes. The author bears no intention of referencing real people, cultures, or events in a literal sense. Readers are encouraged to engage with the work as a piece of creative expression rather than documented reality.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I would like to talk about the deeper meaning and moral lessons of this powerful Western story. At first glance, it is a tale of hardship on the frontier, a pregnant widow, a storm in Wyoming, a broken wagon, dangerous secrets, and a battle against a corrupt land baron. But underneath all that, this story is really about survival, trust, justice, redemption, and the healing power of love. The first important meaning of the story is that strength does not always look like hardness. Ellie begins as a woman who has learned to survive alone. She has suffered loss, betrayal, fear, and danger. Because of that, she believes that depending on no one is the only safe way to live. Her strength is real, but it is also lonely. As the story unfolds, we see that true strength is not only the ability to endure pain, but also the courage to let someone stand beside you. Ellie's journey teaches us that vulnerability is not weakness. Sometimes, the bravest thing a person can do is trust again. A second major lesson is that good people are not perfect people. Colt Mackenzie is not presented as a flawless hero. He carries guilt from his past. He has made mistakes that still haunt him. Yet that is exactly what makes him meaningful as a character. He is not good because he has never failed. He is good because he accepts responsibility, lives with conscience, and chooses decency every day. He helps Ellie not for praise, not for reward, but because it is the right thing to do. This gives the story a beautiful moral truth. A person's worth is not measured by whether they have fallen, but by what they choose to do after they fall. Another powerful message in the story is that truth matters, even when it has been buried for years. For a long time, Ellie's father's death is surrounded by silence, fear, and corruption. Powerful men believe they can hide the truth forever, but the story shows that truth has weight. It waits. It survives in letters, confessions, memory, and courage. Eventually, justice comes not because evil disappears on its own, but because ordinary people decide they will no longer carry the burden in silence. This is an important lesson for all of us. Wrongdoing may remain hidden for a time, but silence protects injustice. Only courage brings truth into the light. The story also teaches us the moral value of choosing love as an act of rebuilding. This is not a romantic story in a shallow sense. Love here is not fantasy. It is shown through action. Staying up through the night, helping with the babies, returning when things get difficult, speaking honestly, protecting one another, and showing up again and again. The most beautiful part of the relationship between Ellie and Colt is that it is built through everyday faithfulness. The story reminds us that real love is not just emotion. Real love is presence. It is the decision to remain when life is hard. There is also a strong lesson about home. In the beginning, Wyoming is described as a place that can kill with cold, loneliness, and secrets. It is harsh, dangerous, and unforgiving. But by the end, that same land becomes the place of healing, justice, family, and renewal. This transformation is deeply symbolic. It tells us that home is not simply where we begin. Home is where truth is restored, where love is proven, and where a wounded heart finally learns it is safe. In that sense, the story suggests that even the harshest places can become sacred when people choose to build goodness there. If I had to summarize the central moral lesson of the story in one sentence, I would say this: people can be saved, not only by courage in danger, but by the quiet loyalty of those who refuse to walk away. Ellie is saved not just by escaping a storm, but by meeting someone who stays. Colt is saved not just by loving Ellie, but by finally stepping back into life instead of punishing himself forever. And together, They create a future for the children that is rooted in truth, rather than fear. In conclusion, this story is much more than a frontier romance or a Western drama. It is a story about how pain can be carried, how justice can be reclaimed, and how broken people can still build something beautiful. It teaches us to be brave, to be honest,